Hi, my name is James Leone. I'm a CPA licensed in the state of California, and I'm here to talk about a number of things, but it's going to start out with some proposed solutions for this tax refund fraud that's taking place around the country. Um, Roughly 2% of our clients got hit by this, and from what I'm hearing from this committee hearing, it's just a nationwide issue, and we're talking about tax refund fraud. There are other issues that are discussed in the March 12, 2015 Senate committee hearing chaired by Orrin Hatch, with Senator Wyden from Oregon also commenting. They had 5 witnesses, and I will, after I go through my list that's concise, I'm going to go through and point out comments that were made that really were more important than the other ones. And I'm also, in general, going to start out by saying that the scams, the scams when people call on the phone or defraud people, you won the lottery, any of those things, aren't things that actually can be solved before they happen. They're not. The panel members are correct. It doesn't take a lot. Really, I'm kind of going to be a little bit critical here. I don't think they should have been in front of the committee because, as a matter of, except to describe the scope of the problem. Because I have nothing against these. I like the witnesses. I think they're doing good things, but we can actually solve tax refund fraud by the way we set things up. But when it comes to phone calls, public education is the only thing that can be done. And just to comment on it a little bit, the phraseology, we're working hard, as much as, it's cliche. What really matters, do they have television commercials from the state of Oregon or the IRS on primetime TV saying the IRS will never call you at home? Not just a news shot in some, local news area, but primetime national TV, major networks. The IRS will never call you at home and ask you for money. No one will ever call you about a tax refund and say you have a lottery. Those things are easily resolved. So I'm not going to talk about them anymore. I mean, not necessarily easily resolved, but they're not anything that legislation or practices that are performed by the IRS and the people they interact with can end up preventing. I'm going to talk about things that can be prevented, how they can be prevented. I'll first propose the solutions, and then I'll go into why I believe those solutions are correct. Okay, so no further ado. The first proposal I have is that the tax agencies should not ever issue direct deposit refunds unless ownership of the bank account is verified. Period. End of story. Now, that's not the only part of it. That's the way it should be. Now, if you ask yourself, what about the cost? We're going to get to that later. I will get to that later. But to quickly state that we've lost $5.8 billion in 2013. We had, in our accounting firm, 4 times the occurrence of ID tax refund fraud than we did before. And so, I'm just doing really dumb math, but you multiply 5 billion times 4, that's 20 billion. That's a lot of money. But even with 5 billion, or 5.8 billion as the number is cited for 2013, you might not save that much money in the first year, but if you set aside an extra 5.8 billion to the IRS for certain upgrades and adequate staffing, doing the appropriate enforcement activities, which I'll talk about, you won't have that loss. It'll pay, that increase will pay for the prevention, and it is preventable. as far as money coming out of at least the IRS coffers and probably the state coffers as well. So to go back, number one, no directly deposited refunds at all until a person's ID is verified. Two, no free refunds unless in fact, no allowing anybody to electronically file a return unless the W-2 matches up with the amounts purported to be earned. And yes, that does mean the return will not be accepted as filed until the W-2 arrives at the IRS. Okay? So now the onus is on the IRS to talk about the elephant in the room, which I will get to. So we got rejection of returns that don't match up with IRS records. I'm sorry, we're in an electronic age. W-2s can be electronically filed. There's no reason why they can't have those records. It's a matter of money. Give them more money. Get more money because we're leaking $6 billion at a rate of 122 million taxpayers. That's $45 a taxpayer that's been lost to fraud. And just about a 20% success rate, and there may be more that weren't even caught. I'll discuss I wonder what circumstances that might happen. Enact taxpayer PIN numbers immediately. Pilot programs, no, immediately. Need more money? Up the budget. This is an underbelly, and I think it's a national defense issue that pretty much at the cost of $45 and an average attempt of around $5,000 per return at a 20% success rate, that there's an open sieve of money coming out from the IRS and into who knows hands, and who knows what they're doing with it. It could be anyway. It could be our enemies anywhere in the world. Period. Close it up. Taxpayer PINs now. Do it through the DMVs of each state. Do it through the State Department of Motor Vehicles. There are going to be some situations where people don't have ID cards. They're too young to have an ID card. We'll have to work that out. I got to figure out what to do about that. But most of the people are going to be covered. Most taxpayers are going to have an ID issued by their state. Utilize the state's ID verification system to send a notice along with their vehicle registration, or their, maybe subsidize this in some way to mail their PIN to them for tax return purposes. Then have an independent part of the IRS administrate only two things. One, the PIN numbers that are submitted to the IRS from the states. And it can be electronically, but don't do the internet, just send it on a tape, okay? And for the remaining people, that there are some circumstances where even young children have income, okay? And under these circumstances, they got to fill out a form and register with the IRS in some way. Period. End of story. We're done with that part. Now there's been talk about, because the W-2 filing date is later than the first day people can e-file, that somehow this allows fraudsters to submit false income tax returns. I'm going to say that is absolutely bunk. What needs to happen, and I'll get into more details about this as I, talk about my evidence to show what goes on, what I believe goes on, at least what was going on in 2006, and may still be going on. Something isn't right. If the W-2 is electronically submitted to the IRS, then how, so you have to mandatorily require W-2s to be electronically filed. But as of now, I would guess that 90% of them are electronically filed. 90% of the time, the IRS is going to already have a W-2 record before a taxpayer does. If they don't, then some congressional legislation has to be made to do something to make sure that they get their W-2 as soon as it's electronically filed. 2, if there's a refund based on W-2 or anything, and the IRS doesn't have record of it, they shouldn't refund it. And I think I've already mentioned that. So no refunds unless the IRS has the information to show that they've received an individual's money and it's posted to their account. Next is that the IRS should require payroll tax returns that are submitted quarterly for people that earn wages. Most of the fraud goes through W-2, so that's why I'm discussing this. That, like most of the states do anyway, that the quarterly returns break down the wages by employee separately, along with their withholding and their Medicare and their Social Security. So that way, what can you do with it after the final payroll tax return is issued? And even if they don't have a W-2, they can do a number of checks. For example, there should be a check to see whether if someone submits a W-2 purporting to work for a certain company, within the W-2 will have a total amount of total wages for the company. They'll have the total withholding, federal withholding for the company. A lot of companies are small businesses, and sometimes, if they see that specifically that the payroll tax withheld on the payroll tax returns is less than the amount of withholding on this guy's W-2 over here, it's trying to get a $5,000 refund, even without the breakdown by employees, they'll be able to catch some fraud. Secondly, if they don't have, if they have it totaled, and I'm just saying Congress should make this a law, just payroll tax returns have to be done quarterly. There has to be a computer system in place that by the time the fourth quarter payroll tax return is filed, mandated electronically as well, and that each employee's wages should also be available and totaled up. So in effect, the IRS will have the W-2 even before it's issued. But most of the time they're issued concurrently with those fourth quarter returns. They can also reconcile the parts to the whole. This employee has this much wages on the payroll return. It's on this much on the W-2. Is it different? If it differs, why? Okay, look into it that way. There's also other enforcement residual effects that are positive. But in this case, even if the employer for some reason fumbles the ball and doesn't get the W-2 out there early before the person tries to file, they might possibly be able to justify a refund from the contents of the payroll tax return. Okay? So that's exactly what I think the IRS has to do. It's quite simple. If the IRS had a policy to not issue refunds until such time that they had the W-2 records in their hands and then in their possession, we wouldn't have this problem at all. We wouldn't need to enact national PINs. We wouldn't need to flag tax returns as to whether they are suspicious or not. Because what's going to happen is there are going to be some taxpayers that are innocent that get caught in this net of suspicion. It's going to be unfair to them what the government should strive for is to not punish taxpayers for criminal misdeeds they're trying to usurp the system. Instead, they should fix the system. Okay, now where do I get this idea that there's a delay? Well, there is a delay because it's mentioned here in the committee, and I guess I can start going to this. I think it's here in from 1409 to 1500. This is Mrs. Ciolo from the IRS. Let's see if I can go over here. Let's go back here, 1409. If I don't get it from her, I'm going to get it from somebody else. But
Surf crimes require immediate action to prevent enormous harm to the American public. To this end, the Tax Division expedites its review procedures in surf cases and has issued Directive 144, which delegates to U.S. attorneys' offices, among other things, the authority to initiate tax-related grand jury investigations in surf matters and to charge those involved in surf crimes by complaint without prior authorization from the Tax Division. The collaborative efforts of the Tax Division and its law enforcement partners has strengthened the response to this crime. Through December 31st, 2014, the department prosecuted more than 1,400 individuals.
Okay, actually, I'm going to stop right here. What I'm going to say she's doing her job, but the focus here, as you can see, is, and hopefully when I'm done talking about this whole thing, you're going to see what I see as the real problem. The approach seems to be that after someone has their ID stolen and has to go through the nightmare of reestablishing their identity with the IRS and getting the records straight, just simply chasing after the people that are filing these fraudulent returns and getting them later does nothing to rectify the original. Prevention is much better, in other words. And also having staff working on enforcement, to my mind, is less effective than, but it certainly is necessary, and it would be irresponsible not to have enforcement. But it's less effective than preventing the problem in the first place. And what I'm pointing out is it's a very simple matter of verification of records the IRS should have already to prevent the problem in the first place. We wouldn't have Caroline Cirolo having to go out and prosecute as many people if the root of the problem were solved, and which I hope to actually get to with Mr. Camus here. He talks in the beginning for a while about public awareness, and it's more or less he's addressing the phone scams, which I really think is just in a committee hearing setting is just no offense intended, but it's mostly hot air. No matter what the person says, they're still gonna go out and they're gonna try to, enforce the law and catch these people. Whether they're here in the committee hearing or not, they're not going to go back to the Senate and vote on a new law. The law already exists, in other words, to go out and catch these, to attempt to catch these people and prosecute them. So they're not saying anything new that the senators need to know, is my point. Actually, that's a better way to put it than hot air. Okay, so let's go to 2003 to 2100 for Mr. Camus. I think this is where he talks about what happens. If not, I'll just keep commenting on this, and then I'll go to let's do here.
If any lottery wins. Just as serious as these scams is the risk of taxpayer refund identity theft. The IRS has made improvements in its identification of identity theft returns before fraudulent tax refunds are released, but continued attention is needed to effectively combat this crime. For example, the IRS still does not have timely access to third-party income and withholding information. Most of this third-party information is not received by the IRS until well after the taxpayers begin filing their returns. The deadline for most information returns with the IRS is March 31st, yet taxpayers begin filing their returns this year on January 20th. This gap in time prevents the IRS from conducting validity checks.
Okay, I'm just going to stop right there, and I'm going to say that is absolutely, utterly wrong, in all due respect. The gap in time does not prevent the IRS from doing validity checks. The IRS policy to issue refunds prior to having a validity check performed is what allows the fraud to take place. And that's all there is to it. Now, going over this list of things that I have, and I guess, to get into more detail of the rationale that I have here, and actually I think I've had some more ideas. I'm saying here, don't issue a refund on, W-2 withholding unless you have record of the W-2 withholding already. That's what they should be doing, in my opinion. There's no excuse for them not doing that in the first place. At the time the return is filed, not 2 years down the road, as has been the practice for the IRS for a long time. I'm going to read one thing. Back in 2006, and I'll get back to this. This is germane. Back in 2006, I was more or less interested in getting more information to taxpayers. I had no idea that the response to my inquiry back in June of 2006, just as a suggested improvement for the way the IRS could run, would contain a paragraph that goes into some detail about the situation as it was back in 2006. And apparently this paragraph had been used before because the supposed dates that were going to be, this is not the first time, I suppose. I'm not the only one that's made this inquiry. There may be other people that have a similar paragraph in a letter written to them somewhere from 2004. Okay. Let's see what it says. This is from the Department of the Treasury, so I'll minimize that. Because I want to get to the heart of the matter. I think the IRS is actually hesitant to say this, or it's possible that the IRS is hesitant to discuss this issue, and we'll listen to what he says exactly, and we'll note that what he's saying is a truthful comment, while what this letter says is also truthful. His is just misleading. Okay, and why would he mislead people? Well, he probably doesn't want to mislead senators, but he probably wants to mislead the bad guys and convince them that, which I'm all for, but I think this is an open secret, is my point. That's what I said earlier. The open secret is that people know they could file tax returns and put numbers on the tax returns that have no basis in reality and get a refund as a result, and because the IRS has a policy of issuing refunds before they have verifiable records. Okay, so here we are. This is what they said back in 2006 when I asked them if they could put W-2 information online, so that way people could look it up there, have some way they could log into an IRS account in a secure way and check for their information that may be relevant to the return that the IRS has and use it to prepare their return should they have lost any of their records. That was my inquiry. The response to the inquiry included a boilerplate response about how they have the ability to provide their transcripts. They say through e-services, but I've never received a taxpayer transcript over the internet, so it's always been faxed to me, and that's what I think they're talking about here. The next paragraph Now they more directly address my issue. I'm saying, put the information online. They wrote this, September 2006. I'm not going to put the guy's name on here because there's really no need to point fingers at anybody. I'm not doing this to say, oh, look, the IRS are bad people. I'm just doing this to show what the circumstances were back in 2006. Quote, it would be difficult to provide complete and accurate information in a pre-filing capacity because W-2 forms are filed with the Social Security Administration, who then shares the information with the IRS. Now, one of my points here, as I said, if W-2s aren't sent to the IRS initially, just have one of the copies go to the IRS, additional copy, and make it electronically filed. That's one of my suggestions here. The information for the current year is generally not available until the year after it is filed with the IRS. For example, W-2 information for 2003, filed in 2004, will not be available from the IRS till 2005. Okay, and the rest is just about 1099s. I shouldn't have had that highlighted. It just says, well, sometimes 1099s are corrected. Yeah. It does make that untimely, but that's incidental. So what they're saying is that, okay, so, just to review for, this is obviously for American taxpayers, that the last date to file a tax return and not be penalized for late filing in the United States is October 15th. The first due date to pay your tax return is April 15th. And what they're saying is it's not until most people get their refunds within weeks after they file their returns. And they, a lot of people will file their returns before April 15th. There's another bulk of people that file before October 15th. But and that's about 90% of all the filers out there. And so what I'm saying is for 90% of the people that file their returns, of which a large portion of those people actually have W-2 income, and W-2 income is, how much you earned at work and how much was withheld at a job that you have. And I would say that, just to be conservative, let's just say 70% of the taxpayers have W-2 income. It's probably higher than that, but we'll just go take it easy on that. I would say in all those cases, even if they filed on October 15th and they got a refund, the refund is going to be processed and cashed in an individual's bank account and done before the W-2 arrives the next year. In almost every case, unless someone doesn't cash the check, it's sitting around. But the IRS won't void a check most of the time. In a rare case, they might void a check, but most of the time they won't. So what they're saying is just about everybody is issued a refund with us not knowing whether they deserve it. Well, how did they deal with that in the past? The way they dealt with that in the past is, once they got the information, they'd compare the return to the information they got from outside parties, the employer, or in this case, actually through the Social Security Administration, and then send a notice if there was a difference. Say, hey, you forgot this, or you said you had this much withholding, but you only had this much, or you forgot to add your withholding, so we're giving you this extra amount because you cheated yourself, or whatever. They'll correct it, basically. But that won't happen until at least the next year, if not more. Okay, so what does it have to do with everything? Anything. So when I look at the GAO report and I hear what he says on this, meeting, let's see if I can get this thing to start again. I think he might get into the dates here.
Of course, legislation would be needed to accelerate the filing of the information returns. The IRS has taken steps to effectively prevent the filing of identity theft tax returns.
Let's stop. Let's go back, and I'm going to go back about 10 seconds. Let's listen to what he says closely here. Okay, let's see, about here.
Is not received by the IRS until well after the taxpayers begin filing their returns.
Okay, that's part one. That's an admission, but it doesn't say how long that is. All right, he's saying that there's a good amount of time that goes by, and he doesn't say how or why. There's a good amount of time that goes by, but he's not saying how or why. But for the most part, when people file their returns, they get a refund prior to the IRS ever knowing what tax has been withheld from their W-2. Okay? That's the first part of what he's saying. Now, it seems as though he's saying something specific, but let's listen very carefully what he says here.
The deadline for most information returns with the IRS is March 31st, yet taxpayers begin filing their returns this year on January 20th.
Okay. So how does that fit in with what I have here? And again, this is dated 2006, and I'm not going to sit here and say that a number of things. I could say, well, this person may have misunderstood what was actually going on at the IRS. Maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe it's down to the months he talks about here. 2, it could have changed since 2006, and I'm unaware of the change. I admit that. It's possible. When I look at GAO reports, they also talk about the same time gap, but I have the feeling that when the GAO goes out to collect information, they interview people, they analyze the information they collect, and they put it into a report. Well, if they get language like this, that is confusing. Why is it confusing specifically? Is because he says, let's go back once again.
Timely access to third-party income and withholding information. Most of this third-party information is not received by the IRS until well after the taxpayers begin filing their returns. The deadline for most information returns with the IRS is March 31st, yet taxpayers begin filing their returns this year on January 20th.
All right, so hold on. He says that the deadline for filing information returns with the IRS is March 31st, but people can start filing their tax returns somewhere in January. I think he said January 15th. Okay. Just so you know, W-2 is an information return as far as I could tell. When you look at a W-2, it says, Department of the Treasury, Internal Revenue Service. Notice he's not talking about where the W-2s are routed to start with. I'm not an expert on W-2 routing post-IRS. I'm not. I'm going by what the letter says here from 2006 and what he says. Now let's think about this on a couple levels. He's not saying where it goes. Why is he not saying where it goes? Well, if he were to sit there and say, well, it goes to Social Security Administration and we don't get the W-2 till, well over a year later, which he kind of implies earlier. He just doesn't mention the Social Security Administration. People might know they have, a whole year to commit this fraud. It doesn't have to be done quickly. He's kind of implying that if they move the filing date back for W-2s to, the same date the e-filing starts, which would be like the middle of January, it's like 2 weeks, that somehow this is going to help. What I'm saying is if this is true, and it goes to the Social Security Administration, who then shares with the IRS, that's not a solution. And therefore, that's why I'm saying that if, in one of my points for improvement, if the W-2s aren't sent to the IRS initially, change the law and get them sent to the IRS initially. So what he's saying will actually work. The only thing I don't know is whether the situation has changed from 2006 to now, and whether, in fact, the way he's implying here is actually the way it does work. That is to say that the IRS will get their W-2s by, March 31st, and they'll actually have them instead of a whole year later, as it's stated in this letter here. Okay, so I don't have that clarity, but that clarity should be sought. Because it's possible that he's not disclosing the delay here because he doesn't want to expose the depth of the problem that exists in our system. Okay. I think I drove that point home. So what I'm saying is let's get. But what I'm also saying is just don't issue a refund unless you have a W-2. Whether if an employer doesn't file the W-2 till March 31st, just for the sake of not losing $5.8 billion of taxpayer money, $45 a person, I think that basic control needs to be in place. We're not going to issue a refund unless we already have record that withholding's been taken, and it's on your W-2, and that's it. I'm also saying that when I mentioned the doing the quarterly payroll returns and probably the annual reconciliation to have it show each employee's wages and withholding and Social Security, Medicare taxes, it does not now for the federal. It does for states, at least in California, and I assume a lot of the other states have that breakdown by employee. If the federal government had that in place, perchance there's nothing they can do about this delay with the Social Security Administration. They could probably compare their own internal records for the payroll returns and just compare that total, because employers file quarterly payroll tax returns. How much was withheld, how much was paid, just break it down by employee. So that comparison can be made if the W-2 hadn't arrived yet. They actually have redundant sources of information for this issue, but for some reason it's not used in the comparisons with electronically filed returns. And that's what I'm saying. Does Congress, it doesn't really solve the issue to have Congress make employers get penalized if they don't send a W-2 out by the second week in January just because the IRS has a policy of issuing refunds under all circumstances whilst not requiring electronically filed W-2s to arrive in their coffers before they issue the refund. So what ends up happening in a lot of these cases is the governments, as you'll see, and I'll go over this with other ones, is they'll end up penalizing the taxpayer. To solve our problem, we're going to make, you'll hear different snippets in here where people, there must have been some innocent people that got caught in these snares these people are trying to do to defend their state treasuries. That there must have been some people that were actually innocent and saw their refunds delayed unnecessarily because the solution was coming from these numerous outside and indirect approaches that are not very well designed to actually catch the problem when a very simple solution already exists. Verifiable information prior to the issuing of a refund. Okay? Let's see if I had any others here. I'm finding that even in the GAO reports and in here, there's a lot of corporate speak and window dressing and time filling, and we're there for the taxpayers. And you'll see some questions that come up that say, like Senator Wyden from Oregon, he goes, well, I believe he asked something like, he mentions, the Anthem Blue Cross leak, which is very fundamental to this whole issue, and hopefully I'll get to the connection between that and how these frauds take place. And that's just one example of the state that our personal data is in, and I'll make an argument that supports my point here about the IRS issuing PIN numbers for everyone and not just select states. There's only about 4 or 5 states that actually take PINs that the IRS keeps a record of and verifies against. I will say that right now, the PIN numbers that you use with your TurboTax or the PIN numbers that are on the pieces of paper that your tax preparers have you signed to authorize the refiling are absolutely useless and pointless. Those PIN numbers aren't compared to anything. Nothing. There's no comparison that those do. They don't stand to protect you in any fashion. Simple as that. So, So when I hear that some of the people that are on the committee, as far as getting to something that can be solved and something that senators can do and that the IRS ought to be doing anyway without having to come to the Senate to tell them, I find those testimonies more useful than just testimony about, oh, we go out and we hold the hands of the old ladies that had their money stolen from them. These people that call over the phone, because that really only has to do with educating the public. And they could say we work hard and use all these cliche phrases to kind of, it falls into the political, yes, but it's like all nicety, and it's not really action unless they're actually just putting commercials on the TV to say, have a sprint for, so after a while people know that there's a commercial. The state of Oregon tells you that they will not call you to ask you to pay up your back taxes, and that the IRS will not call you to pay up your back taxes, and that they don't communicate by email, and all those other things. To let you know that if you get a communication of those types and in those forms, it's not them. That's the only way they can really reach out and do their job, but that's a whole diversion from what is perfectly solvable. And that's the refund fraud. And that's to put some controls in place, what we call in accounting controls. And we don't have them right now. And another comment I have is that I think the focus is too high on after-the-fact law enforcement. You have victims that are left that, they have to fill out a form, they have to go down and talk to the IRS agent. They probably have to prove they are who they are, walk in with their W-2s in hand. They'll see the print on it, their ID number, last year's tax return. There they are. There's their photo ID, all this stuff to prove they are who they are, just so some erroneous records will be removed from their tax transcript. Okay. All because why? IRS policy was to issue refunds prior to having verifiable information. It's a social issue, and a lot of times the day-to-day people get just get stepped on by the elephant that the government is, and this is one of them. There was some of the states here, and I'll play some snippets of some guy that did a really good job, and he had a lot of useful information in his testimony. But at the end of the day, that behind that smile, where he's happy about the fraudsters that he caught, there were some people that were actually innocent that had to go through a good amount of inconvenience just to get their refund. And to them, there's a guy smiling about the fact they were inconvenient. You know what I mean? And then when I look over the GAO reports that are issued, these are reports by the Government Accountability Office, where they look at the system as it is and try to make recommendations. Look over statistics provided by the IRS and, criticize it, or say maybe it could have been measured in a different way, or what have you. I'm seeing a lot of discussion about how the taxonomy of electronically filed returns, when returns are e-filed, they are put into text files with tags in them. And there's like pages out of maybe a 50-page report, maybe 10 pages just talking about taxonomy of the contents of a text file that acts as a tax return that's electronically filed. Literally text, like you type in Microsoft Word with some special tags, so it couldn't be mistaken for Microsoft Word, but it's text, and it gets sent up wherever they collect their information from e-filed returns and put into the tax agency's system. Whether you change the markers of tags for taxpayer's first name, last name, social security number, those are all minor issues compared to the major issue of information verification for one, and two, perhaps just everybody gets a PIN, not just in the 4 or 5 states the IRS is doing right now. You will actually be rejected if you ask for a PIN if you don't live in certain states in the United States. As of now, if you go to the IRS website, this is April 2015. Now let's talk about the scope of the problem and how this whole thing happens. But before I do that, I'm going to say this is what I would say to Congress if I were there to testify. Little old me. Just one CPA in the state of California. I would, if a law needed to be passed to send a copy of the W-2 to the IRS immediately, I would pass that law. Pretty bipartisan. Pass a law that would only allow refunds to be issued after the verification of payments, and the only exception would be refundable credits like the earned income credit, where you get a refund even though you didn't pay anything, or education credits. If a refund is generated by supposed payments by the taxpayer to the system, that those have to be verified before they're refunded. I would also say that the $5.8 billion lost would easily pay for upgrades to the infrastructure of the IRS, such that it's able to handle the electronic submission of W-2s, if that doesn't exist, to implement programs to compare the contents of payroll tax returns with W-2s or tax return contents, to redesign the payroll tax form, to get more people working in enforcement and more computer equipment by which to implement these. That's what I would say. I would say this is a national security issue. We don't know who is, if there's a lot of money leaking from our country to external states, some of which may be our enemies and some of which may be very vicious in the way they conduct themselves, that would be really an eye-opener to see that our policy of not requiring verification to get your refund is costing or is actually turning out to be a way that we're assisting people we are at war with, to say the least. I mean, how would we feel if we found out we were sending $5.8 billion to ISIS last year? I doubt that's the case, but. And it also seems it's pretty damned clear, because I'll get back to this point that I'm going to make. And it's a very, very fundamental point. It's clear to me that the IRS really is concealing what the real problem is. And I think it's something closer to the nature of what that paragraph says that I got from 2006. Again, this one. Why do I say that? Well, it's absolutely ridiculous in a day and age where probably 90% of the W-2s are electronically submitted, that I would say 90%. Okay, let's just be generous. 80%. 80% of the W-2s are electronically submitted. That how could it ever be that a taxpayer would have a paper copy of a W-2 quicker? It's impossible for a taxpayer to have a copy of a W-2 before the IRS has a copy of an electronically filed W-2. That just doesn't happen. Moving the tax date back to January 15th does nothing for what should be in place is the verification process. We do it in every other area of finances, and why wouldn't we do it for our national treasury? I'm not necessarily criticizing anyone in particular here, and these people are here representing large groups of people that work together that have to run under, a specific set of rules and come to their express what their problems are, and I would like to hear more details about what specific rules are tying their feet and making them think that it's a good idea to have refunds issued without verification of income. Maybe that's written in the U.S. tax code. That's the case. It needs to change. that's what I would say to Congress. But anyway, so they're saying what they're saying because they've collected the information as they have, and they're just presenting it as it is, and I'm just trying to respond to them. So it's not like I think that anyone in particular on this panel is a buffoon or anything. It's nothing like that. It's more or less that I think the groups that they represent, in some cases, not all of them, some of them are doing everything they can and probably even crossed the boundary of what I think is reasonable to fight the issue in their states. But in case of the IRS, they need to get back and have a clear, concise message of these are the laws we need enacted, and this is what we need the result to be to prevent the fraud and theft, or it's going to continue. All right. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about how this happens. Then I'll go over little snippets here, and I'll comment on the snippets as I go, and I may redo some of them. So according to the GAO report, their belief is that of the attempts at filing fraudulent tax returns that they know of, 1 in 5 are successful, and they never catch the individual who filed the fraudulent return. They also say that the average size of refund requested in one of these fraudulently filed returns is a little over $5,100, I believe. Oh, sorry. It is $5,804. The IRS estimates a higher number than the Government Accountability Office. They say that they lost roughly $6.2 billion and that the average amount of fraud was $5,800. The GAO criticizes that and whittles it down to $5.8 billion, but hey, that's $500 million here and there. We get the idea. We got a big problem. So, what do they do? Oh yeah, and then those are the ones they know about. There's a whole set that they don't know about. These were returns that were, and let me explain what actually happens. Okay, so a crook, a thief, somehow, some way, and there's a myriad of ways, which I will talk about, goes out or goes somewhere, maybe to some online, boutique, illegal boutique, and purchases illegally obtained but accurate and valid matches between names and social security numbers. Anthem Blue Cross is a database of about 8 million people in which names and social security numbers were purported to have been taken. If the group or individual that got that information decides to go on to some, underground black market website and buy 50,000 of the 8 million names and social security numbers from the thief, the original thief or group, they could use those names and social security numbers to file fraudulent tax returns, because that's all the IRS does to authenticate with. The PIN number you provide when you e-file is meaningless. It just has to exist, but the IRS doesn't have a record of your PIN on file already to compare with. It's not that way. Okay, so now the thief has the social security number and the name. What do? Well, they go out and buy the cheapest tax preparation software they can find at Office Depot, or maybe they download it from Intuit. Usually it's TurboTax, and then they go in, they fill out a return, they just make up a number as wages, they just make up a number for withholding, they make up a number for state withholding probably, and they look over the return, and they make up some other things, whatever they have to do to make sure that it says on the last line that you're going to get whatever dollar amount they planned. Who knows what they have in their mind for that particular return to get back. They don't particularly have to have the taxpayer's correct address. The IRS doesn't track your address. The IRS may have record of what your address was last year, but they don't compare it between year and year. There's really no... It's not like it is on TV. There's really, there's no coordination with the DMV. There isn't one database in the sky that some geek in the lab can look through, like in, CSI, and he knows everything about you on one screen and multiple little tiles. It doesn't work that way. So all the IRS really has is some information that they don't even use as a check for verification. And you know what? You want to be able to move and not have to go through a big hassle just because you move to another location, right? I'd rather have them issue PINs, or better yet, just verify W-2 wages before they issue refunds, and withholding before they issue refunds. But anyway, just to let you know, they don't do that kind of stuff. So they can just put any address they want because they're going to direct deposit the funds anyway. They don't care if the address doesn't exist, probably. So they get your name if you're the victim, your social security number if you're the victim, any address they pull out of their backside, numbers they pull out of their backside that's crafted to make the bottom line look like a refund, then they e-file it. And they do this early, as quickly as they can, with as many as they can. And there's a part of the tax return that says, where do you want this money deposited? They take, they have the money direct deposited into a debit card, which one of these guys talks about. In fact, I'll play that right now. I hope. I would say let's try 3331 here. This is a different witness from the state of Utah. He had really good information. He probably takes this the most seriously, I think. Almost the most seriously. They all take it seriously, but he's just... his approach would end up being most effective if followed. So let's go to 31. That's just my not so humble opinion.
For institutions, they were preparers, but one was a new one. And the new one was someone had actual tax returns.
Okay,
not
that's
just
a different
identity theft, but tax returns.
That's a different issue that I'll get into. And that is a scary thought. But let me get up here to 3342, which is just about there.
Returns from the prior year. Now, as we continue to prevent the outflow of fraudulent refunds, we found great difficulty in determining the nature of the financial institution and the account information. Specifically, we found that there was no uniformity in numbering to determine traditional debit cards from traditional bank accounts. In other words, we could not tell whether we were refunding to a prepaid debit card or whether we were refunding to a legitimate bank account. There's an easy fix on this one.
Alright, so what they do is they go out and they buy debit cards from somewhere that's refillable. And they're crafty enough to figure out, which I never had the reason to, but I'm not a banker. I am a CPA. We just do after the fact reporting, but they actually they're actually able to figure out how to assign a routing number, an account number for direct deposit purposes for tax returns on these fraudulent returns. It has no name associated with it, nothing. It's just some random identity-less Visa card, no identity associated with the thing. You buy it at the gas station or something, and it gets charged up to have, $10,000 or whatever assigned to it after, or 5,000, I guess, based on that average, to that card based on the size of the refund. I mean, based on, just the IRS will literally direct deposit the refund into their little debit card that's rechargeable. No ID assigned to it, just a card number. This is bad. It's not traceable. Not a good thing. And that's what I was talking about there. So, getting back to what the bad guy does, they get the software. They somehow have got their hands on, illegally have acquired names and social security numbers. The only thing that's real is the name, the social security number, the routing number, the account number for the debit card. The rest is just made up numbers that result in some kind of roughly the amount of money they want to try to get this time at the bottom, which is roughly $5,800 as a refund, showing they e-file it. It wouldn't take that long to fill out the, and then they wait a week or so, or maybe not even that much, to see whether all of a sudden their debit card is worth an additional $5,000 or not. And they're done. And that's it. That's all they have to do. This is not good for us. And what I'm saying is that recovering this money after the fact is not optimal. For one, it probably costs a lot of time and money, and it still is uncertain whether a prepaid debit card that has no ID associated with it is able to be associated with an individual without spending significant amounts of money. Some of the money would have been spent anyway. Of the money that remains, they can go to court and get it back, but the damage is already done. And meanwhile, who's forgotten? The taxpayer's ID was stolen. He still has to go through this whole, form filling and ID proving process to get a PIN that should be issued to everybody anyway, who's, if they had W-2 income to start with, wouldn't even had the problem if, the comparative process was going in place and the Social Security Administration didn't have the W-2, but the IRS had it, and the IRS had the money and the computer infrastructure to compare the W-2 to it. Now now this guy, the victim, has to go through all this stuff to clean up their credit, and then take the steps still to file, after undoing the damage of the other person, now has to further fix their stuff just to file the return, all because they bought Blue Cross, because they were forced by the national mandate to get their health insurance, and some ass clown broke into, the Blue Cross database, took their thing, and sold it on some fucking forum at 10 cents a head, if you read Krebs on security, you're going to find out that the cost of acquiring illicit personal information is very low. But after the fact, recovery and prosecution is necessary, but it's not optimal, and it certainly isn't the solution. To my mind, people that are testifying about how they're prosecuting isn't really necessary. It doesn't really do anything new. It just verifies that the United States is a functioning democracy, but it doesn't really allow a congressional body to come up with a plan to close this giant loophole in the Treasury cookie jar that people could just grab $5,000 out at a success rate of 20%, at least 20%, and probably more. There's probably incidences where taxpayers try to e-file their returns and TurboTax comes back and tells them your electronic submission has not been accepted. You've already filed your return, or something like that. Someone that's uninformed will just say, "Oh yeah, okay, great. The government did it for me. I didn't have to do anything, and that was great. I didn't have to pay nothing. Especially people that owe are going to use that kind of rationalization, right? If someone owes money to the IRS, they think, they're probably not going to, I mean, an honest person, of course, would want to fix the issue. But if they're not honest or they're marginally honest, they're probably going to think to themselves, or maybe rationalize that the IRS took all the information that they certainly had gathered and prepared the return for them, and use that excuse. And then 2 years down the road, they'll get a notice that's a double whammy. Both for the refund that was issued to someone else, but you do want to file your return in any case accurately, and if you have to do it by paper, do it by paper. That's really the message. But there will be some delays and after effects. Some people might not realize or think to themselves, "Oh, maybe I filed my return earlier and I just forgot," or whatever, right? And so there's going to be some people that get hit by this that aren't caught right away, or that are it's never figured out that the return filed on their behalf was actually fraudulent. Some people could be dead in a few years by the time the IRS compares the fraud with the reality and issues a notice. So just put that into perspective. I'm also going to say at 122 million, I may have already said this, but at 120 million taxpayers and at the GAO's estimate of $5.8 billion, that's $45 a taxpayer. If we just didn't have these fraudulent returns, uniformly everybody could pay $45 less, and there'd be the same amount of money in the Treasury. I'm also going to say duplicate return rejects are not optimal because, again, it's after the fact. That's not a preventive measure. It's listed in the GAO's report. But that's just, it's kind of like trying to stop people from speeding on the street but doing nothing about, maybe, that's not a very good analogy. It's like trying to prevent a disease, but we're gonna wear SARS masks, but we're gonna let the plague-ridden rats roam about. We're not gonna kill the plague-ridden rats. Instead, we're gonna make people wear steel armor and SARS masks. Everything but actually dealing with the root of the problem. And the root of the problem is the authentication. And sometimes there may be cases where people actually take advantage of the fact that someone else has filed for them because they're going to owe a lot of money anyway. I've already discussed that, and they'll eventually get caught, and there'll be a double whammy, both what they would have owed plus what was stolen initially. But there could be, in cases, there are some people that are innocent and not really trying to cheat or anything. They just, for some reason, or get convinced that the government tells me that, my return's already filed, so it must be. Or when they get a notice 2 years later that makes them pay way more than they should have, that the government knows and I'll just pay. Some people are like that. Some people won't even read the details that amounts to request for money from the government, and they just pay. It happens. There's going to be some unrectified damage as a result of not requiring, again, authentication and or record checking, or both. And authentication in the form of a PIN. We say, well, Social Security number is authentication. That's their form. It is. And, they'll just compromise the PIN numbers. Well, no, they won't, because there's a lot of ways that Social Security numbers can be there are a lot more opportunities for thieves to get your social security number than there is for something that would be as unique as a PIN. When you go to buy a car and you need to apply for credit, they're not going to use your taxpayer PIN. When you go to anything to do with credit, which is a lot, mostly even your utility bills are credit, they're all going to want your social security number. You can't, when you go to the taxpayer tip website and it says, if someone asks you for your social security number, refuse it. Or this whole idea that there are good people and bad people, it's okay to give it to the hospital because these are the good guys, but don't give it to some guy down the street. Well, there were, as came to light in this whole hearing, there was whole groups of people that had their social security numbers and names stolen from, say, a hospital database. There were a whole group of veterans in Georgia that had that happen. And then they ended up being the victims of tax refund fraud. It's happened more than once, and the first, Mrs. Ciarolo did mention that. Maybe I'll get a chance to play that towards the end here. So what I'm really saying is that what I find troubling in this whole thing is we have a group of professionals that know how to do their job, but it seems as though the fact that we have a problem keeps them employed. We're putting money, we're representing. Yeah, it's a little more. The way I put it is a little more sinister than what I believe. But obviously, we need to have attorneys and prosecutors to go out there, and they're doing a good job, and they're doing what they're supposed to do to prosecute people that they actually happen to find and catch. But if we don't close the most basic loophole of just giving our taxpayers their own unique PIN number, they're not going to be tossing around to car dealers and putting on credit reports and utility bills, so many different things, or Blue Cross, a lot of things have been compromised in the past 5-6 years that are out there in the form of online databases. So much that I don't believe that a social security number is, a secure way to authenticate anything. But that's what the IRS is doing. They're using the social security number for authentication. It's going to cost more money to create these pins. I understand that. Already addressed that issue, I believe. And, the savings from closing the fraud is going to be what pays for the PIN program. And then I'll just go over some side comments here I have. What I'm saying is, why don't we fix our institutions rather than punishing taxpayers? And in some of these cases, I am going to say that we're punishing taxpayers. We'll get to some of the testimony from one of these states or two of these states, and they'll sit there and they'll say, we've caught some of these people, we've gone out there and we've figured out that, we've sent people notices that the returns were fraudulent. In some cases, there may have been someone that actually filed a truthful and accurate return and gets back a notice from the government telling them that their return is fraudulent. How would you feel? Sometimes the states will blame the IRS for not sharing with them information, but perhaps if they looked in their own payroll departments, they would get that information. Any state that has a payroll tax system in place that collects any kind of payroll tax, which would be any state that collects an income tax for their state, so there's no exception there. There's no incongruity. Nevada doesn't have a state tax. They don't have a payroll tax department, but California does, Washington does, Oregon does. Standard practice is that every quarter a payroll tax return is submitted by the employers to the state. So instead of, going out and knocking on the IRS's door and bugging them to death, who's already overwhelmed, why don't they just go knock on their own state's payroll department or agency or whatever they call it, California's Employment Development Department, whatever they call it over there, or here, or beyond, hither yon, and get the information from them. Next, don't put a bunch of little red flags and overanalyze returns and send out false notices to people about how they filed false tax returns. Instead, just don't issue refunds until you have a verifiable W-2. What I'm going to say is that the phone scams are not in this hearing here, are not really a problem that it's just you can't correct the system by congressional action or by enacting PINs or data verification to solve the problem of phone scams. Phone scams can take place on almost any topic. You just won a new car, but you have to send us $1,000, and your BMW will be outside parked, and the keys will be in the ignition 2 blocks down the road, but first you have to Western Union us $1,000. That's going to happen. They can do that with taxes, too. Call up and say that you're going to, unless you pay up so many thousands of dollars, you're going to go to jail. And that issue is addressed, but that's really not really, we already have a solution for that, as good as it's going to be, and that is to investigate the reports of these incidences, collect the information, hunt these people down, and eventually prosecute them. We can assume that any responsible government is going to do that, so they don't need to come to Congress to tell us that they're doing what they're supposed to do. The ones that are interesting that I want to hear are the ones that are talking about how they're going to solve, the big leak we have in our treasury where money just comes spilling out $5,000 a time to amount to $5 billion. Well, that's just like, gold rush waterfall, The new gold rush is buying TurboTax for $40. We need to close that hole. We need to close it now. I'll talk about the more scary thing later. But basically, that's all they really can do and should be talking about at this hearing. I hate to be critical of Orrin, but that's just what I'm, they're trying to do the right thing, but that's what I'm saying. We actually can solve this part of the problem. The other parts of the problem, they really should separate it, and they should have a hearing on a different date about those problems. If they just, out of curiosity, want to know that state officials are doing their job, which I'm not even sure if that's within the purview of the Senate's role, but whatever, go figure. Okay, what else do I have here? Okay, so now let's just go with some of these little snippets here, I guess. And I'll start with the first witness. She talks about the basic methods of theft. It's Mrs. Cirolo at 1300, and I may have already played part of it, but we'll just do it again. So let's get up here to... Now this is the story of the unsolvable, basically, this first commercial here, just to go over.
Strangers are giving whatever they can to Melissa and Brendan's fund. Right. 9 and was about to be arrested.
I was just like, well, what can I do to fix this? There's no way I can be arrested. I don't have anyone to watch my...
Okay, so that's what it is. I mean, basically, so this is a local news story. And maybe the residents that watch this local newscast will be largely aware of the fact the IRS doesn't call them at home, but does everybody know that across the nation? Did people know that their states won't do that? And if they don't, if they're not putting commercial, the best way to do this, older people watch TV, have commercials on TV, and have them frequent enough that people will remember what is said in the commercials. You know the kind I'm talking about. Let's go to 1300 here. Just where I thought she started to say things that are interesting.
Surf is an example of this type of challenge. In serve crimes, offenders steal Social Security numbers and other personal information. They file tax returns early in the filing season, showing a false refund claim, and then have the refunds electronically deposited to a bank account, loaded on prepaid debit cards, or mailed to an address where the wrongdoer can access a check. Serve crimes often involve multiple offenders at various levels in a conspiracy, and frequently involve employees with access to databases containing large volumes of personal information.
Okay, so that's the case of the nursing home or Veterans Administration Hospital down in Georgia. They got their entire database of names and social security numbers lifted and used consistently, and a bunch of fraudulently filed returns that was eventually caught and they were prosecuted. Okay, now I'm going to go to 1409. She's going to say some more things that were interesting, but my comment basically with this is I'm fully supportive of what she does, but we wouldn't even have this issue if, of course, we just had the record verification or the PIN numbers on a national scale. Even if the PIN numbers are stolen, so what? It's not exactly a so what, but something can be done about that. Instead of having every American vulnerable and then have to go down to the IRS. There's an increased burden at the IRS. Now some agent's got to walk out of his office, come down, talk to you, look at your form, look at your ID. Hi, that's me. Here's my W-2. Okay, let me look. Oh, I can't show you the fraudulently return, but let me compare it. Okay, well, those differ. Okay, I agree. Okay, you're really you, and this is fraudulent. Let me flag the system. And then if he actually knows how to use the computer and it clears, then you get to file your return, but not electronically. Okay, go through all that stuff, and that's pretty much minimizing what happens there. I'm just going through it quickly. What I'm saying is that great what she's doing, but if the only people from the IRS that are talking to the Senate are people that are talking about after the fact enforcement or some of the symptoms of what goes on, especially with refund theft as it takes place, it's too late. And you just got to ask yourself, well, why didn't they just fix the problem in the first place? They should have a copy. They should know what's going to be on your W-2. Most of these frauds, again, as I repeated before, take place. It's the numbers they make up on the return is in effect a bullshit W-2 with a large number of federal income tax withhold relative to the wages. That makes the bottom line bigger. If the IRS was capable of comparing that return with the W-2 they should have, or the payroll records they should have, that wouldn't happen. So they wouldn't be talking about this. She wouldn't be talking about this prosecution, and all that would remain to talk about are the phone scams, which we already have mechanisms in place to prosecute. It's just they're very difficult to trace down, especially when they have the victim wire money onto a, again, anonymous debit card. Okay, so now continue here. I think it was 1409. That's when I thought she started getting back to something that was important. It escapes me, but I will comment on it if I can get there.
Require immediate action to prevent enormous harm to the American public. To this end, the Tax Division expedites its review procedures in serve cases and has issued Directive 144, which delegates to U.S. attorneys' offices, among other things,
Okay, I'm pretty much going to skip this, and basically what she's saying is, they're going to go medieval on the criminals' asses with their law, grok through, AK-47s or whatever. I mean, to the extent that the law can work, it will, and they'll get them. To the extent the law won't work, they'll get away with it, and that's the $5 billion we're talking about. Let's go to 1700 here for Mr. Camus. Roughly.
We may prevent the next person from becoming a victim, which is a very good thing. Each year, the IRS compiles what it sees as the dirty dozen tax scams on its website.
Okay, so again, a lot of this, unless it's refund fraud, this is good. I'm glad they're doing this. They don't need to tell the Senate, in my opinion. They don't need to tell the Senate this because it's just their duty to do this. You know, it's not like they're not asking the Senate to allow them to do it. It's their responsibility. They're allowed to do it by law. All that stuff. So let's go to 20.
Any lottery winnings. Just as serious as these scams is the risk of taxpayer refund identity theft. The IRS has made improvements in its identification of identity theft returns before fraud.
Okay, so yeah, but actually, my opinion, the one fraud that could be stopped is what he's talking about, the tax refund identity fraud. Now, what he's going to start talking about is, well, we've added some analysis features and capabilities to our software back at the IRS to find out and flag and send notices out to people that we think is a fraudulent return up front. And he's including outside normal stuff like any would expect would be their duty to do, which includes, you know, if the Social Security Administration has been informed that an individual is actually dead, then the IRS will be notified about that and will reject an electronically filed return. After a year. The first year, actually, a dead person, if someone dies in March, they still have to file a tax return for that year, so they're dead, but they can file. So it's got to, I don't know how they do that, actually. So I'm not even so sure about that. Anyways, continue.
When tax refunds are released, but continued attention is needed to effectively combat this crime. For example, the IRS still does not have timely access to third-party income and withholding information. Most of this third-party information is not received by the IRS until well after the taxpayers begin filing their returns. The deadline for most information returns with the IRS is March 31st, yet taxpayers begin filing their returns this year on January 20th.
And earlier I commented on that, but it may be a little more clear now that I've been yapping for this long. That in a day and age, again, when we have electronically filed W-2s, and this is why I'm saying that one of my solutions should be that it's mandated that W-2s are electronically filed. And if they had a policy in place, they will not issue a refund unless they have verifiable information from the W-2 they have on record when compared with the contents of a tax return. What he's saying doesn't make any sense. No taxpayer is going to have a paper copy of a W-2 before an electronically filed copy will make it to the IRS. So they should not, just by that alone, by that logic alone, they should not issue refunds for any W-2 they don't have verifiable information against. But in fact, as I suspected, and I pointed out there, it may be they can't even verify things for another year. So then what do you do in that case? Well, you have to change the law and allow for or require that employers send an additional copy of the W-2 to the IRS electronically. And funding be supplied to the IRS to be able to compare the contents of electronically filed W-2s by employers with the contents of tax returns. That's what I'm saying. That's part of my suggestions. Okay. I know I've already talked about that, but we're just doing it again.
This gap in time prevents the IRS from conducting validity checks.
Bullshit.
Of course, legislation would be needed to accelerate the filing of the information returns. The IRS has taken steps to effectively prevent the filing of identity theft tax returns by locking the tax accounts of deceased individuals.
Now, I will say this. That doesn't, no. A dead person has to file a Form 1040 for the months by which they were alive and earning income. Now, of course, when you're talking, to the general public and the senators and all that stuff, you're not going to go into all these little nuances about, Well, the first year they have to do the, the blah 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 blah, and they got all these questions about, how do you handle the dead peoples, and and after how many years do you lock their accounts, blah blah blah. Let's just assume that they wait a year or two before they lock the accounts. But dead people can get refunds. It just goes to their state, and their administrator deals with it. And a state's a legal entity for a dead person.
Prevent others from filing a return using the departed's name or social security number. For processing year 2014, the IRS rejected over 338,000 e-filed returns and stopped nearly 16,000 paper-filed returns through the use of these locks.
Okay, so and I will say this, that one, that doesn't address the issue. The issue is record verification for refunds that are generated by purported W-2s. The IRS gets paid, just to go into this a little further, the IRS gets paid in a number of ways. Either federal income tax is withheld from your pay and sent to the IRS and reported on your W-2, or you pay them estimates. In rare cases, if you earn interest or dividends and you've been flagged with the IRS as a person that doesn't file tax returns, then they'll take out maybe 10%. And if you voluntarily request it, if you have a pension distribution or even Social Security, you can have federal income tax withheld from that. Those are the main ways that, income is withheld. The only income activity that I'm aware of that seems to have a delay attached to it, and I would assume has to do with going through the Social Security Administration, is the W-2s. Everything else, they know what you have, what you don't have. And they can do validity checks. They should be able to do validity checks right then and there. They just need to set up that infrastructure in their computer. I think they just have a problem with their computer systems. Okay, now I'm going to go through, and so this is an example where it's dead people do have to file tax returns, whether it be paper or electronic. And it almost sounds to paper. Almost sounds to me that there, out of 18,000, there could have well been a lot, especially paper filed returns, in which a refund was due for a person that had died. And they had to go through some big hassle because the IRS is not addressing the problem directly, but instead inventing ways to inconvenience the public that will only peripherally kind of address the real issue that's going on. And the real issue that's going on is the fact that they're just giving money away without verifying that people deserve it and waiting 2 years to come back and ask for it. Okay, I'm going to go over to 25 to 51, where he talks about quote-unquote filters. This is later on when he's asked again. I'm not prosecuting these guys. I'm just commenting on what they're saying. This is the state that things are in. This guy probably works really hard, does a really good job. So I'm not, let's just get that straight.
And comment and recommend additional or approved